part, this Dream Art lecture, 18th century British art. We talked about all kinds of different historical events like the Glorious Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, global trade. We talked about nostalgia and architecture when we were looking at all of those different buildings that had medieval or ancient Roman or ancient Egyptian elements. We talked about satirical painting with Hogarth. And at the end of part two, we discussed the Grand Tour and people traveling from England down to Italy to sort of finish their education and visit all of the sites, ancient Roman sites or contemporary Italian sites. And then they brought back art as souvenirs, like drawings from Piranesi or paintings by artists like Canaletto, who gave you a contemporary view of a city and its tourist attractions. So today we're going to discuss how art was affected by the Grand Tour, by people traveling into these places, and then how that affected the tastes of the patrons of art in England and basically across the continent at the end of the 1700s. So from this tradition of looking at art in Rome, artists were drawn to classical sculpture and architecture, and painters and sculptors embraced the idea of perfection and idealism of classical Greece and Rome. And these artists were known as neoclassicists, just basically new classicism. And classicism refers to ancient Greece and Rome. Ironically, they painted scenes that looked really at home during the Renaissance. So it's strange that we don't call them neo-Renaissance artists, but there it is. This is considered the first neoclassical painting. It's by Anton Raphael Mengs. It's called Parnassus, and it's a ceiling fresco. Mengs helped realize the idea of imitation without slavish copying. And what I mean by that is this very much looks like things that you would have seen in the ancient world or during the Renaissance, but the poses aren't exactly the same. He's mixed up elements. He's taken what is considered the best of all of those things and put it in his paintings, but in a new way. And the next slide will explain this further. But I want to talk about this painting first before we talk about how it looks ancient. So this is Apollo, and he is surrounded by the Muses and their mother, Mnemosyne. The setting is a small grove of laurels in which the Muses are grouped around Apollo, and it kind of refers back to Raphael's fresco in the Vatican. So Mengs was definitely looking at Renaissance artists. But also he was looking at recently excavated frescoes from Pompeii and Herculaneum. One of the interesting things about those frescoes is that they were really erotically charged, like orgies and just inappropriate sort of stuff at this period of time. So even though Mengs was trying to embrace the idea of ancient Roman painting, the subject matter was far too risque for his contemporary audience. I want to talk a little bit about the muses in this because I think they're interesting. Muses were meant to inspire people to create, to be creative. So they're all represented here with their different attributes. And I think it's funny that there's just this big blue ball on the bottom in this woman, but she is Urania, and she is often represented as having a globe next to her. And she's like the muse of astronomy. And so all of these women have different symbols attached to them. And if you were looking at this painting in 1761, and you were a well-educated person who'd gone on the Grand Tour, all of these things would be familiar to you, and you'd be able to read this painting. You would even know that's Apollo because of his lyre and his wreath on his head. Earlier I had said that Mengs was attempting to imitate but not copy exactly. And so you can see there are different elements of ancient sculpture in which he borrowed from. For example, the pose is like that upper left pose, and the lyre is like the one on the right. And it's a little difficult to tell, but behind Apollo is this river god, and he's responsible for that little waterfall at his feet. And that was taken from this ancient sculpture as well, but flipped around and not exactly the same. So Mengs, like many neoclassical painters, were inspired by the posture or the musculature or the classical stance of all of these images, but they tried to manipulate them so that they looked fresh. Meanwhile, back in England, we have a painter named Joshua Reynolds who paints this painting called Sarah Bunbury, Sacrificing to the Graces. And I'd mentioned this a little bit when we were talking about the Rococo and how Boucher would insert actual people into paintings of mythological figures. But Joshua Reynolds takes it a step further, in which he makes contemporary figures almost look as if they are living in the past. And this style of painting, in which you insert a contemporary person into a past ritual, is known as grand manner painting. And Joshua Reynolds was like Mengs, and he felt that art should follow the rules that were laid down by Renaissance artists. And he believed that they were following, the Renaissance artists were following the rules of the classical Greek and Roman artists, and idealization as a means to communicate a higher sense of purpose and morality. So basically, making these people look perfect tells you that there's something special and better about them. So what's happening in this image is Sarah Bunbury, Lady Sarah Bunbury, is making a sacrifice to the Graces. And this kind of goes back to that nostalgia thing that we talked about with architecture as well. What we have here is a nice British woman depicting herself as a good Roman matron, even though in some ways it's strange to have her show herself as pagan in the middle of religious worship. I mean, she is a Protestant woman in England in 1765, and yet we are looking at her as if she is a dutiful Roman wife. And that takes us back to morality. I mean, they believed that the Romans were uncorrupted. They were very wrong, by the way, but they had this idea that they were morally superior to the times. And so by inserting yourself into this, you insert yourself into the story of a higher, purer morality, and you are better because you understand the values of the Romans. I mean, the Romans did have this whole thing about virtues. So it's not weird, it's just that they were also not great either. But what's interesting in England is that not everything has to be the same. And this is actually a rival of Joshua Reynolds. This is Thomas Gainsborough. And he didn't believe in idealizing his portraits. He painted subjects in contemporary attire located in their contemporary environment. And this was a practice that Reynolds believed was too grounded in base reality. It was like, do we aspire to the ideals of the past under Reynolds, or do we appreciate what is great in our own time in Gainsborough? And this painting is so in your face to Reynolds because, first of all, this is just the son of a young hardware merchant. He's not royal, but he's wearing this blue, which is like a royal color. And it's almost an homage to Van Dyck, who we talked about earlier. He actually resembles a painting from Charles II, who was the son of the king who got his head cut off. And the other thing that's interesting is that Reynolds thought that blue should only be used sparingly, while Gainsborough dresses this boy in blue from head to toe. So you've got this competing idea of contemporary dress, realistic landscape, and he said he painted portraits for money, but he painted landscapes for himself. So he really loved the contemporary English landscape. So while Gainsborough and Reynolds were battling it out, you had Joseph Wright, who was doing his own thing, but he kind of was embracing both ideas. The ideas of the Enlightenment, which were a contemporary movement, but also the ideas of classicism. So Joseph Wright was interested in documenting all of the amazing things that were happening in England at the time. And this painting, I love this painting because basically this is the first depiction of an art history class. So with Velázquez, we saw the first time someone cooked eggs. This one is the first time a bunch of students sat around and looked at a work of art. So you can see that's a classical Greek sculpture that they're all looking at there. That's the disc thrower. And people commissioned Joseph Wright to make these paintings about different discoveries. This is a discovery about ancient art. This teacher is discussing a classical statue with his pupils. The teacher is the one in the dark, the older one, and the pupils are the two younger ones that are on the right side. This is a contemporary setting, but it employs a classical motif. So you have like the Rococo, where there's always some sort of statue in the painting to refer to classicism. In this one, it's a necessary element because they're discussing this. It's in the service of science. It's close observation that lends to a deeper understanding. This is empiricism. This is the Enlightenment. This is the idea of looking closer and being honest about what we see. You will have a lecture question on this painting, so pay close attention to it. So here's another painting by Joseph Wright that does a bunch of things. First of all, that's Caravaggio-esque, right? That sort of chiaroscuro with the dark and light, but also it's in service of something. So just like that statue in the last one wasn't placed there randomly, the light is a very specific part of this painting. I mean, generally this kind of light and dark is used to heighten the drama, and it is sort of heightened. I mean, does seem like we're in the middle of something. But there's more to it than that. This instrument that they're all kind of sitting around or standing around is an orrery, and it's a mechanical device that shows the relative position of different bodies in the solar system. And the light source, which is a candle, is supposed to be the sun, and so they're looking at how planets travel around the sun. And so Joseph Wright uses chiaroscuro in this as an educational tool. And maybe in the last painting as well, and that's what the lecture question will be about. But I love these paintings because I'm always a fan of when someone can incorporate a bunch of stuff in a new and interesting way. And I think Joseph Wright does that. I think he's really innovative and interesting, and he uses all of these tools that are available to him to say something new. Okay, the last style of painting that we're going to talk about in England, because we've covered a lot now, is history painting. And there are two ways that history painting can go. You can either embrace this idea of neoclassicism, in which you paint a historical event from the past. For example, this is, I think, the Ark of the Covenant being carried across Egypt. Or you can paint a contemporary historical event. And so what we're going to look at in this last part of this lecture is how both things were done in England at the time and how they are different from each other. And it's up to you to decide which you like better, but painting some historical event was the pinnacle of the painting hierarchy. And so now we're going to see how this plays out in England. Okay, so we're going to start with the neoclassical, and we're going to talk about Angelica Kauffmann. And she was Swiss, but she was a member of the British Royal Academy. She was one of two women who were members of the British Royal Academy. And this is an interesting painting because it has all these men standing around sketching this nude man, and the women aren't there, but the pictures of them are up there. I don't know which of these two is Angelica Kauffmann, but she's up there, so she's included. But she can't be around when there's a nude man because that would be inappropriate. So she lived in Rome for a long time, and she made neoclassical portraits for these young men or travelers on the Grand Tour. And she specialized in history paintings, but of the neoclassical style. So earlier when we talked about Hogarth, his satirical paintings were supposed to teach people how to behave better, have better morals. And there's another way to do this, which is by taking a story from ancient Rome or Greece, which is a morality tale, and then you let the viewer apply the lessons of the story to their contemporary life. So you can be like Hogarth and say, you're all horrible people, you need to be better. Or you can be like Angelica Kauffmann, who is saying, look at how amazing these people were in the past, we should try to be like them. So here's an example of that. This is called Cornelia Pointing to Her Children as Her Treasures. And this is a large-scale painting, and it depicts a virtuous example from Roman history. The story is Cornelia Africana is the daughter of the general Scipio Africanus. She was a Roman matron. She was exemplified by the virtues praised in that society of modesty, chastity, and honor. And so, again, the Romans had all these virtues, and by comparing yourself or having these paintings in your home, you're saying, I have these virtues as well. So her family was of high ranking. She was considered one of the highest preeminent matrons. She was still a woman, so she didn't have any rights, but at least she was important in society. Her importance comes from her two sons and their political legacy. They are Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They're often referred to as the Gracchi, and they were politicians in the 2nd century BC, before Rome was an empire while it was still a republic. And they're remembered for attempting to pass land reform and other progressive measures to ease the hardship of the lower classes. They were trying to reform the Roman Republic. Both were assassinated during their tenures as tribunes or leaders by their peers of the patrician class. The patricians were the wealthy nobles. And Cornelia is shown conversing with another matron. And the other woman has come to Cornelia's home on a social call, and she's showing off her new jewels and her fancy adornments. And when the visitor asks Cornelia, "Can you show me your jewels or your fancy adornments?" she points to her two sons, the Gracchi, to come forward, and she says, "These are my greatest treasures." So you can see that this painting is filled with like this maternal sentiment, and Cornelia serves as an example to all British women that we need to be loyal mothers and raise good sons and not worry about the vanities of life because family is most important. And these are good lessons. But the way that she's presenting them is through this ancient classical style, as opposed to like kind of beating you over the head like Hogarth does with Lawyer Silvertongue and Earl Squanderfield. She's basically appealing to the better nature of people, whereas Hogarth is saying, you're all horrible people and you need to be better. Okay, so let's juxtapose that neoclassical painting of Cornelia and her treasures with this painting of the death of General Wolfe. And this is a contemporary battle against the French that happens in Canada. And you can tell because there's a Native American kneeling in the front, and the guy above him is in green, and he's dressed as like an explorer on the frontier. This battle is happening in a bunch of different stages, and they're coming to tell the general that they won, but if you look to the right, they're still storming the beach, so it's supposed to give you the entire story of the battle. And General Wolfe is surrounded by other soldiers, but if this were a real battle, they would have been fighting and they wouldn't have had time to watch him die all elegantly. What's interesting about this is you don't usually see generals in uniform in the middle of dying in paintings or sculpture. Usually they're standing triumphal or they're sculpted to look like Roman generals. Always they look like Roman generals. It's a very strange thing. But it's supposed to equate them with the strongest military ever, the Roman Empire. But he almost has a Christ-like pose about him. It's almost like there's this heavenly light shining down on him. And there's no blood, so the painter, Benjamin West, doesn't want to creep you out too much by showing all of the blood falling out of him. But he's trying to give you this moral view of this, which is he's a martyr. And look what Wolfe has sacrificed for you. Okay, we'll leave it there. You guys have done great. This was 3 very long parts. I combined 2 lectures into 3 parts. And as your reward, I leave you with this.